Welcome to Turning Moments into Movements, where each week we explore simple but powerful wellbeing tips to help you live a balanced and fulfilling life. My name's Leanne Ross, your host and the founder and coach of my business, Happy Luya, and I will be taking you through today's 15 minutes of insight and inspiration. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this week's episode. This week's episode is all about burnout. And what we're going to cover in this episode is the typical signs that people experience when they are either right in the heart of burnout, or they're on the cusp of burnout, or recovering from burnout. So we are going to cover all angles because these symptoms that we're going to explore typically remain with us throughout that whole burnout cycle. And the reason why I specifically wanted to cover burnout for this week's episode is the day it is released is the day after a lot of people will be returning to work after the festive break. And what I find is, or what many people find, is when we stop, when we take time off, that's when our symptoms of burnout are probably going to be most prevalent. Have you ever noticed when you have been really busy at work and then you take some holidays, take some annual leave, and then you end up getting burnt out and unwell? And that's really, really common. It's because the mind and body suddenly stop, and you're either more aware of these symptoms, or these symptoms have a chance to kind of be released. What you'll also find is many people will not just be returning to work today. Many people will have worked throughout the whole Christmas break, so maybe they will have experienced even further experience of burnout in December, because that can be a really busy month for a lot of professions. So I am talking to each and every one of you, whether you've had that time off or not. Burnout and being aware of it is so important. So what I'm going to cover is 5 typical signs and symptoms that people experience when they are going through that cycle of burnout. And kind of a loose pun intended here, but these signs are not exhaustive. Like, the list is endless. It's really personalised, your signs and symptoms to burnout. So I'm going to be covering typical ones that people find, but please engage in that self-awareness so you start to recognise your own signs and symptoms, because recognition and being aware is going to be a really great way to, to engage in that early intervention. That's what I'm trying to say. Awareness is key. So if you are able to recognise your typical signs and symptoms when you do engage in those kind of high activities, high stress levels that ultimately can and will lead to burnout, the more knowledge you have on that, the more important it is to take note, because then you can engage in that early intervention. So, before I dive in, one more quick statement. I have done a bonus material episode this week, and it's to tell you about my Reset to Restart 4-week program. And this is a course that's designed to support people who have experienced burnout and either never want to experience burnout again, or are typically in that cycle of burnout where it's repeated, where you just can't get out of it. You're constantly feeling burnt out, or you'll maybe recover from burnout and then you will feel burnt out, maybe a few months later. So I've devised a very carefully devised a 4-week program that really talks you through a 4-step process that can really break that cycle and really help you to redesign your life to ultimately to a brighter future without burnout being included in that. So make sure you check out that bonus episode. It's also been released today. It will give you a bit of an insight around what the programme looks like, and you guys, as my listeners, have a very special price. So make sure you check that out in the episode show notes. I will also put my cycle of burnout framework in the show notes, so you can also reference that. I don't specifically cover it today. It's something I will cover in future episodes, but just for reference, it's always just helpful just to kind of have that in mind when we are talking about burnout. So the 5 signs of burnout that I really wanted to cover were the physical aspect. Physical is one that typically shows up quite early when we are experiencing high stress and burnout. What I typically find with me is I get sore shoulders, I get a tight jaw, and I get a sore back and hips. And that's a mix of me staying at a desk and working hours and hours and hours and hours of overtime. And also, that's where we typically hold stress in the body. So if you have sort of unusual aches and pains that, just feel a little bit out of alignment, and you maybe can't reflect on why you have a bad back, but suddenly you do, watch out for that, because that could be a sign of burnout coming. Similarly, tiredness, fatigue, your sleep being affected, and that feeling of exhaustion, that can all typically be signs of burnout as well. When we are really stressed and we have got so much on, or we are having to cut our sleep short because of the high demands within our lives, it will inevitably affect our physical health. Similarly, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, holding the breath, changes in the breath. So if you were quite a deep breather and now you're quite a shallow breather, all of them are symptoms of burnout as well. So really things to watch out for. And I should, I guess, put a disclaimer here that if you have concerns around your physical health, and we will cover mental health later on, please liaise with a medical practitioner to make sure that your needs are being met from a health perspective. So just always like to put in that disclaimer. The second sign is detachment. So detachment from just overall life. We can feel quite indifferent to things that used to really light us up. We might not be present, so we might not be engaging in mindfulness. So we might just, be physically present, but our mind's elsewhere. Have you ever been told that? Have you ever been, speaking to someone and someone says, like, you're just not all here today, like, what's going on with you? Similarly, wanting to be alone, those feelings of isolation because you have so much on, you want to just detach yourself from other people because, you can't almost handle that volume of interaction because you live such a busy life already. So any time that's maybe a bit more of a down period, you want to be detached from people. Similarly, compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is, it is what it says on the tin. It's being tired of caring. So it's generally linked to people. So quite often health professionals, people who are natural caregivers, who are supportive people, who offer people support. So it could be social work, paramedics, police, NHS staff, mental health first aiders, HR, union representatives. There's so many others. Counsellors, coaches. Oh my gosh, coaches, yes. compassion fatigue is real, and it's something that can affect a lot of people, and it typically is a sign of burnout. So just watch out for that one. Another area is, within the detachment, is having that all or nothing mentality. So being all in and being detached from everything else. So for example, if you throw yourself into work in the heat of burnout, you just detach from all your personal life. Or the other way, you completely detach from work. You maybe go off with work-related absences, you go off with stress and burnout, and you just completely detach from work because that's what you need to do. So that feelings of detachment, that behaviours around detachment are really key areas to look out for. The third one I wanted to focus on was having a negative outlook. Having a change in perspective is such a huge area of burnout that a lot of people don't touch on. So we're talking about those feelings of bitterness, those feelings of being resentful to your job, resentful to the people there, maybe resentful to people in your life who are calling you out and telling you that you're working too hard and that you're going to get burnt out. That irritability, just being irritated by people, feeling overwhelmed, engaging in that toxic workplace. I certainly engaged with that. I'm typically a positive and insightful person, at least I like to think that. But when I'm burnt out, I will be the one that will be ranting and raving and, just being annoyed, and I'll be quite negative. So those are really key areas to reflect on. So if you are starting to just have a bit more of a negative outlook in life, another sign to look out for, because that could mean that you are either on the cusp of burnout or you are already right in the midst of it. The fourth one is poor mental health. Now, what we find is well-being, which is my bag, that's what I coach. Well-being and mental health are very much interlinked. And I will be putting signposting in the show notes. So if you do need specific mental health support, you can link into that, because having access to that resource is really going to be important. But typically, experiencing low moods, being diagnosed with depression, experiencing anxiety, being diagnosed with anxiety, they are all very much linked to burnout as well. So that really stagnant mood, not feeling able to make changes in your life, they're all typical signs of depression, feeling really stagnant, being stuck in a fixed mindset, having low moods. Similarly, when we look at the physical sensations, feeling overtired, not being able to sleep, aches and pains, negative attitudes, negative perceptions. So, not that I can diagnose, but really just reflecting on poor mental health and the impacts that can have on burnout and the impacts that burnout can have on mental health. So really important that you do reach out to those specialised external professionals that can provide you that bit of support when we are looking at supporting our mental health during times of burnout, because they absolutely correlate and they will both be affected when we are looking at burnout as a whole. The last area I wanted to touch on was time. And this is one I wanted to include because this is something that's really prevalent for me when I was in experiencing signs of burnout. And it's one that typically people don't really talk about, but I do know it affects a lot of people because I talk to a lot of people. So typically time in relation to time management. So people who have poor time management or don't have the strategies are probably not able to put in the strategies because they're not able to engage in positive decision making. When we are subject to burnout, typically that's very much interlinked with stress. And when our brain is affected by stress, the three main areas that are affected are decision making, the ability to self-soothe, and memory recall. So when we look at that, if we're not able to adapt positive time management strategies that we maybe had implemented before, that shows that maybe that decision making, that memory recall has not been kind of switched on during those high times of burnout. And what you find is it's a cycle in its own right. You know, when we are experiencing burnout, it's typically because we have overworked over something. And the more we overwork, the less time we have. But then the more we overwork, the less awareness we have, the less access we have to that crucial parts of the brain around decision making. So it's really, really key that we are aware that if we suddenly just don't have time for anything, for self-care, for personal care, for, looking at our life as a whole, and making, positive changes within that, that's really key. That's a really, warning sign that we need to be looking out for when we are reflecting on burnout. And I just mentioned self-care. If we're not tapping into self-care and we're having to cancel that, or we don't even have time to tie that into our schedule, that often will show that we're, at that sign of burnout as well. Because we're not prioritizing, we're stuck in that negative outlook, we're stuck in that maybe poor mental health cycle, we are detached. So all of that will come into play when we are looking to engage in positive coping strategies and self-care techniques. Lastly, environment, and this is very much covered in the time management. And people can have their environment change in two different ways. If you're burnt out, your house in effect could be an absolute shithole. There might be dishes everywhere, clean washing piled up, dirty washing in the basket that's overflowing. Your house might be dusty. These can be signs of burnout because you've just not had time to do anything else because you're so exhausted from having to deal with everything else. And then other times your house is absolutely immaculate, everything's scrubbed clean because that's a coping strategy. And I'll have to do another episode on this, but when we do experience signs of burnout, it can be really difficult to stop. So sometimes when we do have that spare bit of time, we will, use that to excess. So we'll maybe spend like 3 hours, completely scrubbing the whole house when it's maybe been done, yesterday. So having, time or lack of time is another area around signs and symptoms of burnout to look out for. So to recap quickly, because I am a little bit over time, the 5 signs of burnout to look out for are the physical aspects, the changes in perception, the detachment, poor mental health, and time being affected. Make sure you check out my bonus episode so you can learn a little bit more around how to really break out of these cycles, how to support yourself, and really live your best life without burnout being part of it. Thank you so much for listening, and I will speak to you all next week. Bye! Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Turning Moments into Movements. Why not check out coaching opportunities with me so you can really begin to enhance your moments into huge movements and begin to live the life you never thought possible. Details are in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, leave a review and share this episode. Remember to also follow me on social media platforms through my handle Happyluia, where you will receive additional daily content. And finally, make sure you join us next week for more tips on how you can turn your small moments into life-changing movements.